All right, welcome to the deep dive. You know how this works. We take your source materials, go deep, and try to pull out the most important stuff. A shortcut to being informed without drowning in information, right?
Exactly. And today's deep dive, today it's all about the monetary system, really digging into how it works, maybe where it's broken. And we'll look at alternatives, too, based on what you sent from Lawrence Lepard's book, The Big Print.
Yeah, the big print. Lots of interesting stuff in there. Our mission today is to unpack his main arguments, right? What does he see wrong with the system? And what are the consequences? And what are the solutions, if any? Lepard comes right out the gate with a bold statement. Something is seriously wrong in America today.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that,
Yeah.
like they're working harder and harder, but not really getting ahead.
For sure, it's like this constant uphill battle. And Lepard connects that feeling directly to the monetary system. He argues it's been rigged, essentially set up to benefit a small elite.
Mm-hmm. A financial and government elite. And this leads to a lot of the problems he sees. Wealth inequality, bad policies, even things like perpetual wars, he says.
So it's not just about economic cycles or typical ups and downs. He's saying the system itself is built on a shaky foundation. And it creates that sense that things are unfair.
Right, even if people can't articulate exactly why. It's like this underlying unease with how things work. And to illustrate this, Lepard shares some personal stories that really bring it home.
Yeah, like his dad's business back in 1980. It's really a story about the unintended consequences of trying to fix a problem.
Exactly. So after the U.S. goes off the gold standard in 1971, right, inflation starts to rise. And Paul Volcker, the Fed chairman at the time, takes drastic action. He jacks up interest rates to like 20%, tries to wrangle that inflation.
20%? That's insane.
Yeah. And it worked eventually, but it caused a lot of pain in the process. Lepard's dad, he had a furniture business. He had taken on debt like many businesses do. And when those interest rates skyrocketed,
He got squeezed.
yeah, pushed him to the brink of bankruptcy. Really highlights how these big macroeconomic decisions can have a devastating impact on everyday people.
Absolutely. It's not just numbers on a spreadsheet, right? It's real lives. And then Lepard talks about his own experience during the 2008 housing bubble.
Yeah, this is a fascinating story. He sees the crash coming, right? He's shorting financial stocks, betting against them, and his fund is up over 50%.
Wow, so he was reading the market right.
But then the SEC steps in, bans short selling of financial stocks. They say they're trying to protect the banks.
Trying to stop the bleeding.
But Lepard is forced to unwind his positions, and because of that, those gains he had, gone. He plays by the rules, and he loses big time.
It's a pretty harsh lesson in how the game can change suddenly and how, as he puts it feels rigged.
Yeah.
And it's not just these high finance situations either. He talks about how his in-laws, who were retired and living off their savings, were really hurt by the Fed's response to the 2008 crisis.
Yeah, the Fed drops interest rates to near zero. The ZRRP, zero interest rate policy.
Or trying to stimulate the economy.
Right. But his in-laws, they were relying on income from those CDs, certificates of deposit. They were getting a decent 5-6% return, and that just vanishes.
So while the Fed is trying to save the system, they're also hurting people who are just trying to live off their savings. And that brings us to the bigger picture, right? What does Lepard argue are the broader consequences of this system? Wealth inequality is obviously a huge one.
And it's not just about technology or globalization, he says. Those things play a part. But he believes the real culprit is this mispriced capital caused by the monetary system.
What does he mean by mispriced capital?
Well, he argues that artificially low interest rates, the Fed sets, they create this distortion. They inflate asset prices, things like stocks and real estate. And who benefits from that? People who already own those assets.
So the rich get richer.
Exactly, and that gap just keeps widening. And he sees a whole slew of negative consequences stemming from that. Political instability, for one. When people feel like the game is rigged, they get angry. You see a rise in populism, both on the left and the right. It creates societal dysfunction.
Right. It erodes trust. It's like a breakdown of the social contract.
Exactly. And he also links it to things like poorer health outcomes, which might seem surprising at first.
Yeah. How does that fit in?
Well, he points out that the U.S. spends more on health care than any other country, but our health outcomes are actually getting worse. We have declining life expectancy, and medical bankruptcy is a leading cause of bankruptcy overall.
It's like we're pouring money into a system that's not delivering.
Right. And it's all part of this bigger picture he's painting, where the system is not working for the average person.
And then there's the decline of American manufacturing, another piece of the puzzle.
He points to the decision to admit China into the World Trade Organization. in 2000 as a key turning point.
A lot of people argue that was a mistake, that it accelerated the offshoring of jobs.
Yeah, and he's one of them. He says this was driven by financial and business interests seeking cheaper labor. And the result? American workers lose jobs. Wage growth stagnates. But corporate profits go up, share prices soar, and executives get richer.
So it benefits the few at the expense of the many.
Exactly. And he cites this really striking statistic, the ratio of CEO pay to average worker pay. In 1950, it was 20 to 1. By 1989, it had jumped to 58 to 1. And in 2021, a whopping 324 to 1.
That is a huge gap. Okay, so we've laid out some of the problems. Now let's dig into one of Lepard's central themes, inflation. He calls it a hidden tax.
Yeah, and he really challenges that idea that a little bit of inflation is just normal and healthy for an economy. He points out that the Fed actually targets a 2% inflation rate.
2%, that doesn't sound like much.
But think about it. Over 10 years, that compounds to a 20% loss in purchasing power.
So your money's worth less.
Exactly. And he argues that this is essentially a stealth way for the government to devalue the currency. It's a transfer of wealth from savers to debtors. And he quotes Milton Friedman here.
What does Friedman say?
One of his most famous lines. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. In other words, it's caused by increasing the money supply. And Lepard then points to the growth of the U.S. money supply, M2, as evidence.
So more money in circulation means each dollar is worth less. It makes sense. But it gets really interesting when he starts talking about how the government measures inflation. He argues that the official CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is flawed.
Right. And he says it understates the true rate of inflation. He breaks down several ways this happens.
Okay, I'm curious. What are they?
So first, there's substitution. The idea is that if the price of one good goes up, people will just buy a cheaper alternative. So if steak gets too expensive, you'll buy chicken. But what if you really wanted steak? It doesn't really capture the true cost of maintaining your lifestyle.
It's like saying, well, you're poor, but you can still eat, so it's not that bad.
Exactly. And then there's what's called hedonic adjustments.
Hedonic adjustment.
Yeah, it's basically trying to adjust for improvements in quality. So if a car costs more, but it has new safety features, they might say the price hasn't really gone up that much.
Right.
But it's really subjective, right? What if you don't care about those new features? Bill Fleckenstein uses cars as a great example. He shows that between 1996 and 2021, the actual price of cars increased by 308%.
Wow, 308%.
But the CPI for cars only went up by 71%.
That's a massive difference. So the official numbers are really masking the true cost increases.
That's Lepard's argument. Then you have geometric weighting, which gives less weight to items that are rising in price the fastest, so it artificially lowers the overall rate.
So if the things you need most are going up in price the fastest, it gets downplayed.
Exactly. And lastly, there's owner's equivalent rent.
Okay, now that one always confuses me. What is that about?
So instead of using actual housing prices or mortgage payments, they try to estimate how much it would cost to rent your own house. But it's all theoretical, and it tends to understate the true cost of housing.
Right, because rents aren't always keeping pace with actual home prices.
And Lepard believes all these adjustments lead to a big discrepancy. He compares the CPI to data from shadow stats.
What is shadow stats?
It's an alternative measure that tries to calculate inflation using the methodologies from the 1980s before all these adjustments were put in. And their numbers are consistently much higher than the official CPI.
So it's like two different realities. And Lepard doesn't shy away from speculating why this might be?
No, there are political reasons. High inflation is bad news for politicians. Right. And a lot of government programs, like Social Security, are indexed to the CPI. So if inflation is higher, the government has to pay out more.
It's a powerful incentive to keep those numbers down. Now, Lepard digs into history, looking back at past warnings about fiat currency. Some of the quotes he shares are pretty scary.
Like Daniel Webster, back in the 19th century. He said that paper money, when it's not redeemable for anything of real value, represents nothing but broken promises.
Strong words.
Yeah. And he also said that inflation is the surest way to fertilize the rich man's field with the sweat of the poor man's brow.
It's a very vivid image of how wealth gets transferred.
And then there's Voltaire, right? Paper money eventually returns to its intrinsic value zero.
Not exactly a comforting thought.
No. And Lepard argues that history shows this pattern again and again. Governments with the power to create money eventually abuse that power. They print too much, and the currency collapses.
So if fiat currency is so flawed, what's the alternative? He talks about sound money. What does that even mean?
Sound money is money that can't be easily manipulated by governments. Think of something like gold or silver.
Right. Precious metals, they're scarce because of geology, right? It's
Right.
hard to just create more of them.
Exactly. And Lepard also points to Bitcoin as an example of sound money. Its supply is limited by a mathematical algorithm. Only 21 million Bitcoins will ever exist.
So it's like digital gold. And he brings in this analogy from Lynn Alden. She talks about money as a ledger, a record of value.
Yeah, and she says there are different forces that govern those ledgers. Commodity money, like gold, is governed by nature, by how much gold is actually in the earth. Bank money, that's our fiat currency, is governed by nation states.
By central bank.
Right. And then open source money, that's Bitcoin, is governed by its users, by the network itself.
So it's a different kind of system based on technology and decentralization.
Exactly. And Lepard quotes Nathan Lewis, who talks about how crucial a stable unit of measure is for an economy to function well. Prices are information signals.
They tell us what things are worth, what to produce, what to consume.
Right. And if that unit of measure is constantly changing, it distorts those signals. He calls fiat money monopoly money. There's no real foundation.
It's like playing a game where the rules keep changing. And that brings us to another big idea, the dangerous mix of money and politics.
Lepard argues that going off the gold standard in '71 was a major turning point. It completely intertwined money and politics. The value of the dollar is now determined by government decree, and politicians are often tempted to debase the currency for short-term gain.
Print more money to fund their programs, win elections.
Right. And he even quotes George Washington, warning about unfunded paper money and how it can ruin a nation's credit. Tony Deaton expresses similar concerns more recently.
It's a timeless problem, it seems.
And he brings up Judy Shelton, who was nominated to the Fed board, but she was very outspoken in favor of sound money, a gold standard. And she faced a lot of backlash from the financial establishment.
It shows you how deeply entrenched the current system is.
Yeah, there's a lot of resistance to change. Now, Lepard goes back to the basics, talking about classical economics. Why is he bringing up these old ideas?
Well, it's about understanding the fundamental principles of economics and how they've been distorted.
Exactly. Classical economics, with thinkers like Adam Smith, emphasized free markets, limited government, the importance of savings and capital formation.
Right.
They believe that's what drives true economic progress.
It's about producing more, not just printing more money.
Right. And he uses this great little story about three siblings. One saves seed corn, one saves laying hens, and they work together to build a fishing net. They're all delaying immediate gratification, investing in the future.
And that's how they build wealth over time.
Exactly. Wealth grows from what we save, not what we spend. And he connects this to real-world examples, like the invention of the cotton gin.
How does that fit in?
Well, the cotton gin was a huge leap in productivity, right? But it was made possible by people saving and investing in new technology. And Lepard contrasts this with Ludwig von Mises' description of capitalism as unceasing economic progress.
Which is not what we're seeing today.
He argues that the current system, with all its manipulations, is actually hindering real economic progress. And he talks about the importance of free market prices as signals.
Supply and demand determining the true value of things.
Exactly. But he says the Fed, by setting artificial interest rates, distorts those signals. It leads to malinvestment, to bubbles and busts.
So we get these boom and bust cycles. Okay, so that's the theory. Now Lepard walks through some historical examples of how these things have played out. He starts way back in the early 19th century.
Yeah, he talks about the 1814 specie suspension, when the U.S. stopped allowing people to redeem paper money for gold or silver.
And that led to inflation.
Right. And then a boom and bust cycle linked to the Second Bank of the United States. It's an early example of how messing with the monetary system can cause instability. Then he moves on to something called the Great Depression of the 1870s.
Wait, there was a Great Depression in the 1870s?
Yeah, but it was a very different kind of depression. This was actually a period of tremendous economic growth and innovation, but prices were falling. And this challenges that conventional wisdom that falling prices are always bad.
So deflation can be good.
Lepard argues that if it's driven by increased productivity, yes. Murray Rothbard points out that in a free market, falling prices due to increased efficiency actually benefit consumers.
Things get cheaper.
Right. But of course, that's not how things always work in practice. Then he moves into the early 20th century, the period leading up to the Great Depression of the 1930s.
And the creation of the Federal Reserve.
Exactly. He argues that the Fed's early policies, their inflationary policies, contributed to a lot of social unrest and instability in the 1910s and 20s.
Like what?
He points to things like race riots, the Spanish flu pandemic, the rise of Ponzi schemes, even the Black Sox scandal in baseball, where players were accused of throwing the World Series.
It was a really tumultuous time.
Yeah. And he sees some parallels to what happened during COVID, this mix of economic and social upheaval. And he quotes Murray Rothbard again, who calls the Fed a governmentally created cartel device.
So it's about benefiting the banks.
Right. Rothbard argues that the Fed allows banks to inflate the money supply in a coordinated way. And then there's Ludwig von Mises, a key figure in the Austrian school. He predicted the Great Depression, basically.
How did he do that?
His Austrian business cycle theory explains how artificial credit expansion leads to malinvestment. You get this boom, but it's unsustainable. And then it collapses. And he was right. The Great Depression happened pretty much as he described it.
Interesting. So the Austrian school has a pretty good track record, it seems.
Well, they certainly have been warning about these things for a long time. And Lepard argues that the gold standard actually helped the U.S. recover from the Great Depression. He cites research by economists like Ben Bernanke and Barry Eichengreen.
So going back to sound money could actually be helpful.
That's his argument. He also digs into the role that Britain's decision to return to the gold standard at an overvalued rate played in the lead-up to the Depression, and the U.S. Fed's actions under Benjamin Strong trying to help Britain.
They were all connected.
As a global system. And Strong's inflationary policies in the U.S. contributed to the stock market bubble in '29, which then burst, of course.
Setting the stage for the Depression. He also talks about something called yield curve control. What is that?
After World War II, the U.S. had a huge debt. To manage it, the Fed and the Treasury essentially capped interest rates on government bonds. They were willing to print money to keep rates down.
So it's another form of manipulation.
Right. And Lepard points out that back then, the U.S. was able to grow its way out of that debt. The economy was expanding. Today, it's different. We're relying on financial engineering, on more and more debt.
Kicking the can down the road. And then, of course, the big one, 1971, Nixon takes the U.S. off the gold standard.
A pivotal moment, for sure. Lepard says it was driven by the government financing its deficits, especially the Vietnam War, by printing more dollars. They called it deficits without tears.
Spend without consequence.
Exactly. And other countries started getting nervous. France, under de Gaulle, started demanding gold for their dollars.
They saw what was happening.
And Nixon, facing a drain on U.S. gold reserves, makes the decision to sever the link between the dollar and gold. We enter the era of pure fiat currency. Lepard sees this as a huge mistake.
It removes a key constraint.
Right. And he argues that the period from 1971 to the present is characterized by increasing financialization, bailouts, and what he calls free money. It's the rise of this two-tiered system.
Where the wealthy get bailed out and everyone else is left to fend for themselves.
Yes, socialism for the rich, he calls it, versus rugged capitalism for everyone else. And it starts with the runaway inflation of the 70s, when we see those oil shocks and the fallout from Vietnam spending.
And Volcker comes in to fight inflation with those huge rate hikes.
Right. But those hikes cause a lot of pain, too, as we talked about with Lepard's dad's business. And then we see the start of this bailout trend with Lockheed in '71.
Setting a precedent.
Yeah, and it continues. Penn Central Railroad, Chrysler, Continental Illinois Bank, the S&L crisis in the '80s, which cost taxpayers a fortune. He contrasts this with the Enron scandal in 2001, where executives were actually held accountable.
There was some justice there. But more recently, it seems like the big players always get a safety net.
That's his argument. And he points to this huge spread between what savers get and what borrowers pay.
Like low interest rates on savings, but high interest rates on credit cards.
Exactly. It's a great deal for the financial institutions, but not so much for everyone else. And he sees parallels to the Roaring '20s, all that speculation and abuse, which led to reforms like Glass-Steagall.
And then, of course, those reforms were later repealed, which paved the way for the 2008 crisis. But he does mention a period he calls the golden age of fiat currency in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, that was a time of relative stability. He points to a few factors: disinflation, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which reduced geopolitical tensions, and a more productive use of debt.
So things were working better, for a while at least.
But then we get Alan Greenspan as Fed chair, and his tendency to cut interest rates after any little wobble in the market. And that, he argues, helped fuel the dot-com bubble.
Easy money leads to speculation.
And then the LTCM bailout in '98.
That hedge fund that almost brought down the system.
Yeah. And the bailout created what economists call moral hazard. Barry Ritholtz, who Lepard quotes, argues that it incentivized risky behavior.
Because they knew they'd be bailed out.
Exactly. And he talks about Reagan's tax cuts, which freed up capital but also led to bigger deficits. And then the SEC rule change in '82 that allowed companies to buy back their own stock.
Stock buybacks, that's been a huge issue.
Yeah. It used to be illegal, seen as market manipulation, but they changed the rules. And it shifted the focus away from dividends and towards inflating share prices.
Which benefits executives with stock options.
Right. And then we get the subprime mortgage boom, all those NINJ loans, no income, no job, no assets.
Crazy lending practices.
Yeah, and the banks were making a fortune on the fees and the high interest rates. And they were bundling these risky mortgages into these complex securities, selling them off to investors.
Passing the risk along.
And the credit rating agencies were complicit, giving these dodgy securities good ratings.
It was a recipe for disaster. And then Bear Stearns collapses, and the crisis really starts to unfold.
Yeah, and then Lehman Brothers and all these other firms are on the verge of failure. Hank Paulson goes begging to Congress for the TARP bailout. It's chaos.
And the government steps in, again, with trillions of dollars.
Right. And Lepard points out that this was a double whammy for a lot of Americans. First, the dot-com bubble bursts, then the housing bubble. Their savings are decimated.
It's like a 1-2 punch.
Yeah. And he even shares this story about the wives of some big investment bankers getting sweetheart loans from the Fed's TALF program.
So even during the crisis, there's this sense that the connected few are benefiting.
That's his point. And then there's the whole private equity game, the dividend recapitalization strategy.
What is that?
They buy a company, load it up with debt, and then pay themselves huge dividends. It's basically extracting wealth from the company.
And the company is left saddled with debt.
Exactly. He calls it legalized theft. And then we get into the era of quantitative easing, QE.
Printing money on a massive scale.
Yeah, after the GFC, Bernanke says the Fed's balance sheet will shrink back down. But it doesn't. It expands 5-fold in 6 years.
So they just keep printing more.
And then COVID hits, and the response is even bigger.
Or
Trillions more in QE, interest rates slashed to zero, new lending programs.
it's like they panicked.
Yeah. And Lepard points to this strange moment where U.S. Treasury bonds were actually selling off during the initial COVID panic. He sees it as a sign of waning confidence in the system.
People were getting scared.
And then Powell comes out with his shock and awe announcement, and things stabilize. But all that spending, the PPP loans, the stimulus checks, it adds up to huge deficits.
And those deficits eventually lead to inflation, right? Which brings us back to the problem.
Exactly. And then we have Silicon Valley Bank collapsing in 2023.
Another sign of fragility.
Yeah, a classic bank run. And the Fed steps in again, creates the BTFP, the Bank Term Funding Program, to bail them out.
More mouse click money.
Lepard's phrase. And he argues that the Fed now has this unofficial third mandate, keeping the financial system afloat.
It's become the backstop for everything.
Right. And he talks about the internal dissent within the Fed,
Yeah.
how Bernanke would scold anyone who disagreed with him.
Trying to maintain a unified front.
Exactly. And he mentions Chris Leonard's book, The Lords of Easy Money, which is very critical of the Fed. The fact that it got so much mainstream attention is interesting.
It shows that people are starting to question the Fed's role.
Yeah. And he brings up Janet Yellen's comments before the '08 crisis, dismissing the housing bubble. They were completely blindsided.
Okay, so we've covered Lepard's critique in depth. Now he gets into different schools of economic thought, revisiting classical economics and contrasting it with Keynesian economics.
Keynesian economics has really dominated policymaking for decades. It's all about government intervention, managing the economy through spending and taxes.
But Lepard seems to favor the classical approach.
Yeah, he sees it as more aligned with sound money principles. And he makes this point about Paul Samuelson, a very influential Keynesian who predicted mass unemployment after World War II when government spending was cut.
And he was wrong.
Completely wrong. The economy boomed, which suggests that maybe the Keynesian model isn't always right. And he's quite critical of Keynes himself, calling him an advocate for government control.
He quotes that famous Keynes line, "In the long run, we are all dead."
Yeah, which Lepard interprets as basically saying, don't worry about the long-term consequences, just focus on the short term.
Which is a very dangerous attitude when it comes to money.
He also contrasts how the two schools measure economic progress. Keynesians focus on things like GDP growth and full employment. Classical economists, and especially the Austrians, focus on productivity, efficiency, sound money.
It's a different way of thinking about it.
And then he introduces the Austrian school in more detail, with figures like Karl Menger, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek.
What are the key ideas there?
The Austrians emphasize individual action, free markets, sound money. Menger explained how money arises organically from the market as the most liquid good. Von Mises developed the Austrian business cycle theory, explaining how credit expansion leads to bubbles and busts. Hayek won a Nobel Prize for his work on this stuff.
So they've had a big impact, even if they're not always in the mainstream.
Right. And Lepard ends this section with this interesting analogy, comparing Fed Chair Powell to General Custer. The point being that Powell is facing the consequences of decades of bad decisions by his predecessors.
He's inherited a mess.
Exactly. And that brings us to part 2 of the book, where Lepard lays out his solution. And it's a surprising one. He argues for embracing deflation.
Deflation, that's like the ultimate economic bogeyman, isn't it?
Yeah, most economists, especially the Keynesians, are terrified of deflation. They think it will lead to a downward spiral, a depression. He even quotes Janet Yellen warning about this.
But Lepard disagrees.
Strongly. He presents research showing that historically, the link between deflation and depression is weak. In fact, most periods of deflation didn't coincide with depressions at all.
So deflation is not always bad.
He distinguishes between 2 types of deflation. One is caused by a contraction of the money supply, which can be painful. But the other type is caused by increased productivity. And that, he argues, is good.
Why?
Because when productivity increases, prices fall. But if wages stay the same, people can buy more with their money. Their standard of living goes up.
It makes sense.
But he points out that financial institutions and governments, they hate this kind of deflation.
Why? Because they're in debt.
Exactly. Deflation makes their debts harder to repay. And he brings in Jeff Booth, who argues that we're running an inflationary monetary system in a world that's becoming increasingly deflationary due to technology.
So there's this fundamental mismatch.
Right. And that's where Bitcoin comes in. Lepard sees Bitcoin as a decentralized solution.
Sound money for a deflationary world.
Exactly. It can't be inflated by governments. It's controlled by the network, by its users. He emphasizes this idea of self-sovereignty.
You control your own money.
Right. No one can confiscate it, censor your transactions. And he suggests that Bitcoin could actually make it harder for governments to finance wars.
Because they can't just print money to pay for them. Interesting.
And he points to Bitcoin's rapid growth, its unique features, the fixed supply, the privacy, the ease of use. He sees it as a tool for freedom.
And then he takes this big step back, looking at the history of centralization and decentralization.
He argues that we're in this cycle. The Industrial Revolution was a period of centralization, leading to great advances. But then World War II was like peak centralized power. And now, with the digital revolution, things are shifting towards decentralization.
It's like a pendulum swinging back and forth.
Right. And he talks about Britain's decline, how abandoning the gold standards contributed to that, and Germany's hyperinflation in the 1920s.
A cautionary tale.
Yeah. And he sees Bitcoin as part of this new wave of decentralization like the internet before it.
Disrupting the old order.
And he talks about his own experience, missing the boat on Microsoft. He learned a lesson about holding on to transformative assets.
Even if they seem risky or strange at first.
Then he sees parallels with the early internet, investing in companies like Netcom.
And Bitcoin is giving him that same feeling.
Yeah, like something big is happening.
Yeah.
And he gets back to those core functions of money, medium of exchange, store of value.
What makes something good money?
Carl Menger said it's about being the most liquid good, the easiest to trade. And he talks about the Lightning Network, a technology that makes Bitcoin more practical for everyday transactions.
So it's becoming more usable.
Yeah, he sees a lot of potential there. Now, of course, he gets into predictions, which are always